Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale brings lessons, love, and unexpected turns that shape who we are. Today, we share a powerful story about Jake Anderson, a young artist caught between his passion and his father's high expectations. When tragedy strikes, secrets are revealed, and father and son must navigate grief, loss, and a path toward healing. Their journey teaches us about family, understanding, and the courage to follow our hearts. Join us as we explore the emotional depths of love and transformation. Subscribe now to begin today's story. I want to tell you about Jake Anderson, a boy whose love for art stood in stark contrast to the world of business he was born into. You see, Jake was never meant for the ordinary life of numbers and corporate deals. He had a different path in mind, one that was painted in vibrant colors and sculpted through emotions. But the world he grew up in, that of his father, William Anderson, was far from artistic. Jake was 15, sitting in his room on a sunny Saturday afternoon, the light streaming through the window, illuminating his easel and the canvas in front of him, the soft scent of fresh paint mixed with the earthy tones of the trees outside. His masterpiece was taking shape, a breathtaking rendition of the Rocky Mountains, bathed in golden light, as if capturing the very essence of the landscape itself. To anyone who knew him, it was clear that Jake was talented, far beyond his years. Yet, there was one person who didn't see it that way. William, Jake's father, stood in the doorway of his son's bedroom, watching quietly. He had always been a man of business, a man who had built his car dealership empire from the ground up. At 45, he was a self-made man, known for his sharp mind, unwavering determination, and an iron grip on the family business. But his pride and confusion swirled together like a storm when he looked at Jake. Pride, because his son was his flesh and blood, and confusion because he couldn't understand what his son was doing with his life. "Is that what you've been working on all day?" William finally asked, his voice thick with something that was hard to place. Perhaps it was frustration. Or maybe just a deep sense of helplessness. Jake smiled up at his father, his hands stained with paint. "Yeah, just finishing up the mountain scene from last summer's camping trip," he replied, his eyes bright with excitement. William forced a smile but couldn't hide the skepticism in his voice. "Looks great, champ," he said, but there was something distant about his tone, a subtle disconnect that Jake had come to recognize all too well. "But don't you think you should be learning the family business, instead of spending all your time painting?" Jake's heart sank, though he tried to hide it. It wasn't the first time his father had made comments like this. It seemed as though every time he shared his passion for art, William's thoughts would drift back to the business, the dealership, the legacy he was building. All Jake had ever heard growing up was how important it was to keep the family name alive, to take on the business and make it grow. He knew his father didn't understand his art, but he had always hoped that one day, maybe just once, William would see things differently. His mother, Emily, came into the room, her presence always a soothing balm to the tension that lingered between them. She smiled warmly at Jake's painting and walked over to stand beside him. "It's beautiful, Jake," she said, her voice full of affection. William sighed and glanced over at her, his frown deepening. "But where does he get this artsy stuff from?" he muttered, as though the mere thought of art was some alien concept. "Nobody in our family has ever picked up a paintbrush unless it was to paint a wall." Emily's smile softened. She had always been Jake's biggest supporter, and despite their differences, she understood him better than anyone else. "Does it matter, Will? Look how happy he is. He's passionate about this, and that's more important than anything else." But William wasn't convinced. He wanted Jake to learn the dealership business, to take over when the time came, to understand how to run a company, make deals, and build something solid. "A man needs to know how to make his way in the world," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "A man needs to follow his heart. But he also needs to eat. Not everyone is meant to sell cars and intimidate competitors." "Will," Emily said gently, though the weight of her words carried the power of truth, "not everyone is meant to follow the same path you've walked. Jake felt the tension in the room. It was the same argument they had over and over again. His heart longed for the freedom to paint, to create, to express the beauty he saw in the world. But for William, the idea of art as a future was impossible to grasp. He had worked so hard to build what they had, to create a life of financial security, and he just couldn't see beyond that. Want to see it? Jake asked, trying to change the subject. His voice tinged with hope. William forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Sure, champ. Show me what you've got. Jake turned the canvas toward them, revealing the mountains in their full glory, bathed in the soft, golden light of a setting sun. Emily gasped. Jake, this is incredible. You've captured it perfectly. William looked at the painting for a moment, his eyes softening. It's really something, son, he said, though there was a hint of confusion still in his voice. Later that night, after Jake had gone to bed, William poured himself a drink in the quiet of his office. He sat at his desk, the room dimly lit, and stared at the photo of his late wife, Emily. She had passed away 2 years earlier, and the grief was still fresh in his heart. He didn't show it, not to anyone, not to Jake, but it was there, always, and it haunted him. Emily entered the room, closing the door behind her. You've got that look again, she said softly, sitting across from him. William took a long sip of his bourbon and sighed. I worry about him, Mary. The world isn't kind to dreamers. Mary looked at him with soft eyes, understanding the weight of his concerns. The world isn't kind to car dealers either. Will, you know that, but we don't have to fight this battle alone. We're in this together. But William couldn't let go of the fear that clung to him. The fear of losing his legacy. He knew the dealership was his life, but he couldn't understand why Jake didn't want to follow that same path. He needed to figure out how to help his son see the importance of the family business, the future he had built. And so, the divide between father and son grew, not from lack of love, but from misunderstanding. Jake had dreams, and William had his own vision of what the future should hold. But neither of them could see the other's world, and it would take a journey they never expected to bridge that gap. It's strange how life can change in a heartbeat. One moment, everything feels solid and secure, and the next, it's as if the ground beneath you crumbles away, leaving you to navigate through the rubble. That's exactly what happened to Jake and his father, William, on the night of Jake's 16th birthday. It should have been a night of celebration. Friends were over, music was playing, and laughter filled the air. But as Jake moved through the crowd, something felt off. His eyes found his mother, Grace, standing by the wall, clutching a glass of water. She looked pale, far too pale, and her usual warmth seemed dimmed, like the light inside her had been turned down. Mom, you okay? Jake asked, moving toward her, concern rising in his chest. Grace gave him a faint smile, though her eyes didn't carry their usual sparkle. I'm just tired, sweetheart. It's your day. Go enjoy yourself. But Jake wasn't convinced. He had known his mother for his entire life. Her strength, her presence, was always the cornerstone of their home. But now, she seemed fragile, as if something unseen was slowly draining her. Mom, you really don't look well, he insisted. Maybe you should sit down for a bit. Grace brushed him off with a light touch on his arm. I'm fine, really. Go have fun with your friends. This is your special day. Jake hesitated, but he finally relented and turned back to the party, though his heart wasn't in it. Every time he glanced at his mother, his worry deepened. Her usual energy was gone, replaced with an unsettling stillness. It wasn't long before he saw his father standing by the grill, flipping burgers. Jake moved toward him, his steps quickening as an unsettling thought gnawed at him. Dad, something's wrong with Mom, Jake said, his voice tight with concern. William looked at him, an expression of disbelief crossing his face. What do you mean, son? She's probably just tired. It's been a long day. No, Dad, it's more than that. She's pale, and she's sweating, and... Jake's words faltered as he saw his father's expression shift from dismissal to worry. William's eyes narrowed as he looked toward Grace. He set down the spatula and walked toward her with quick strides. Jake watched, unable to shake the fear that clung to him. The party came to a screeching halt when Grace collapsed on the couch. Her breathing shallow, her face was flushed with fever, her body trembling uncontrollably. William rushed to her side, panic starting to take over. "Call 911, he barked at Jake, his voice thick with fear. Now. Within minutes, the paramedics arrived, rushing her out of the house on a stretcher. Jake followed closely behind, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't bring himself to say anything as the ambulance doors slammed shut, the sirens blaring as they sped away. The next few days blurred together in a haze of sterile hospital corridors, cold coffee cups, and doctors in white coats who spoke in terms that Jake didn't fully understand. Each word that came from the doctors felt like a blow to his chest. Rare lymphoma, they said. Aggressive. Advanced. Jake wanted to scream. How could this be happening? His mother, the woman who had always been there for him, the woman who was the heartbeat of their home, was slipping away. William, too, seemed lost. He sat by Grace's bedside for hours on end, his eyes hollow with worry. Jake could see the cracks in the mask his father wore. For so long, William had been the strong one, the one who held the family together with an iron fist. But now, he was as fragile as the rest of them, his hands shaking as he held Grace's. The doctor gave them little hope. The treatments, they explained, had a poor success rate. 3 to 6 months, the doctor said quietly, but we'll try everything we can. In the hours that followed, William became a man on a mission. He called specialists, searched for experimental treatments, reached out to anyone who might offer a glimmer of hope. Jake watched his father, seeing him struggle in ways he had never witnessed before. This wasn't the man who had built a successful empire. This was a man lost. A man desperate to save the person he loved more than anything. But as much as they tried, nothing seemed to work. Grace's condition worsened, and within 3 months, she was gone. The funeral was a quiet affair. People came and went, offering their condolences, but it felt like a dream. A nightmare that Jake couldn't wake from. He stood beside his father, his face pale and hollow. As his mother's casket was lowered into the earth, he couldn't bring himself to cry, though the weight of the loss felt like a leaden weight on his chest. Not here, not in front of all these people, not in front of his father. Jake didn't speak much that day. There was no need. Everyone understood the silence between them, the grief that hung thick in the air. Afterward, the house felt emptier than ever. Jake would walk through the rooms, expecting to see his mother in the kitchen or hear her humming softly to herself as she moved around the house. But all he found were reminders of what had been lost. Her favorite mug still sat on the kitchen counter, a relic of the life that once was. Her clothes still hung in the closet, untouched. It was in the stillness of the nights that Jake truly felt the absence. He would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet the storm in his mind. The grief was so thick, so consuming, but his father, William, seemed to be struggling in his own way. Jake had never seen his father like this before. The man who had always been so strong, so sure of himself, was now a shadow of the person he once was. It was hard for Jake to understand. The grief was too much for either of them to handle alone. And yet, neither of them knew how to bridge the distance that had grown between them. They were two people, living under the same roof, but so far apart, neither one of them knew how to move forward. After the death of Grace, Jake felt the weight of loss settle over him like an unshakable cloud. The absence of his mother was a gaping hole, and while time passed, nothing seemed to fill it. Jake's relationship with his father, William, had shifted. They still lived under the same roof, but they were like two strangers occupying the same space. William had become a shadow of the man he once was. More withdrawn, more distant. The once strong, determined businessman had retreated into his office, his hours spent poring over reports and financial statements, as if trying to escape from the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. Jake spent more time in his room, in his art studio, where he could express his grief. his confusion, his longing through paint. But despite the solace his art provided, he couldn't ignore the tension in the house. The unspoken words that hung heavily between him and his father. It was late one night when everything changed. Jake had just finished a painting, his brush strokes slow and deliberate, when he heard the sound of muffled voices in the hallway. He couldn't make out the words, but he recognized the intensity in his father's tone. William was talking to someone who seemed to have his father's full attention. Jake crept closer to the door of William's office, his curiosity getting the better of him. He pressed his ear against the wood, straining to hear. The conversation was heated, though he couldn't quite catch the words. But one thing was certain, his father was afraid. Afraid of something. The next morning, William seemed on edge, his usual confidence replaced with a nervous energy that Jake hadn't seen in a long time. He went about his day like nothing was wrong, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when William left for a meeting, that Jake decided to investigate. His father's sudden erratic behavior was too strange to ignore. Inside the office, Jake rummaged through papers on his father's desk. Bills, contracts, financial statements, and then he found it, a folder labeled Horizon Enterprises. Jake flipped it open and found documents related to the sale of Mitchell Motors, the family business that had once been the center of their lives. There were also letters from the Davidson brothers, his father's longtime rivals, discussing buyouts and threats. His heart raced as he flipped through the pages. Everything was happening so fast, so out of his control. But the most shocking thing of all was the last page, a signed document transferring ownership of the dealership to Horizon Enterprises. The company name sent a chill down Jake's spine. His father had sold the business without telling him. Jake couldn't understand it. Why would his father do this? Why would he sell everything? Especially now, after Grace's death? What was going on? Later that evening, Jake confronted his father. The tension in the air was palpable as Jake entered the living room where William was sitting, his face buried in a glass of bourbon. The familiar bottle was a silent reminder of how far his father had fallen since Grace's passing. "Dad," Jake said, his voice shaking. "What is this? Why did you sell Mitchell Motors? Why didn't you tell me?" William's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he set the glass down. "You don't understand, Jake. You can't. I did what I had to do." "Had to do?" Jake repeated, his voice rising with frustration. "You sold the business, our family's business. You didn't even think to involve me. I thought you were building something for us. What happened?" William sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping with the weight of a secret he had kept hidden for far too long. "Jake, I wasn't just selling the business. I was saving us. The Davidson brothers were making moves. They'd been after me for years. And if I didn't sell, they were going to take everything we had. My life, my security, everything. It was the only way." Jake stared at his father, his mind racing. "You sold everything to protect us. And you didn't even tell me? And now, what? I'm supposed to just go along with this?" William stood up, pacing the room, his hand running through his graying hair. "I never wanted this for you, Jake. You think I wanted you to be part of this world? This world of deals, threats, and business rivals? I wanted you to have a choice. A chance to make something of yourself. But I wasn't going to let the Davidson brothers destroy everything we had worked for. Not without a fight." Jake's anger faltered, replaced with a sense of disbelief. "But you faked your own death. You made me think you were dead." "Why?" William paused, his face drawn and tired. I had to make it convincing. For them, and for you. If anyone suspected, they would have kept looking for me. It was the only way to make sure you were safe. To make sure we could start over." Jake's world tilted. His father had faked his death? He had gone to such extremes to protect him. To protect their family. And yet, he had never shared any of this. Jake felt betrayed, confused, and strangely proud all at once. William had made choices for Jake's future. But he hadn't given him the chance to be part of it. The silence between them was thick, neither knowing what to say next. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, Jake spoke. "What now, Dad? What happens next?" William's eyes softened, his voice quieter now. "We start over. Together. There's nothing left to fear." The revelation was like a weight lifting off Jake's shoulders. His father's secret life, the threats, the lies, it all made sense now. But what really mattered was that, despite everything, they were still a family. And together, they could face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in months, Jake felt a flicker of hope. A new beginning was possible. As the days passed, Jake and his father, William, began to rebuild their lives in ways they hadn't imagined. The shadows of grief and loss still lingered, but the understanding they had gained from each other forged a new bond. One rooted in respect, empathy, and a willingness to face the unknown together. The cabin in the mountains had become their sanctuary, a place where they could heal, not just from the pain of losing Grace, but from the weight of secrets that had kept them apart for so long. For Jake, the world of art was still his passion, his escape, and with his father's newfound support, he began to truly embrace his dreams. William, though still a man of business, had learned the importance of letting go and allowing his son to chart his own course. Even if it wasn't the path he had envisioned, they were no longer defined by their differences but united by the love they shared for the woman they had lost, and for each other. In the quiet of their new life, they had found peace. The future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape. Together, father and son stood on the threshold of a new beginning, ready to face whatever life would throw their way. And so, the story of Jake and William Anderson continued, a tale of loss, love, and unexpected paths, proving that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found, if you're willing to seek it. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more life stories.